Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I feel like I've been having a lot more connection with my listeners through the Q&As and polls. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started. Hi everyone, I'm Amber Rose, the Religious Hippie, and welcome to A Catholic's Perspective. For those of you just finding this podcast, let me tell you a little about myself. I was born and raised a cradle Catholic until I fell away from the church for 8 years. I just recently came back to the church, and I could not be happier with where I am today. I am currently a junior in college, and I'm studying graphic design. I am an ambassador for multiple amazing Catholic Christian companies, and I love working with all of them. Now, some of you may already know me from my popular Religious Hippie social media channels, such as TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have all kinds of Catholic content on there, so don't forget to go check those out. So the reason I wanted to start a podcast was so that I'd be able to have a longer format which people could listen to from wherever they are. I particularly wanted to address issues that young Catholics face today in the secular world, and I want to do that by providing information along with commentary and even a little of my own opinion. I can't lie, from time to time I might be discussing very controversial issues, and some will find my opinions unappealing. But I do this out of my faith and service to God. We must keep communicating with each other, respecting each other, and put each other on the path to sainthood. I think you'll enjoy the podcasts coming up, and I thank you for being here with me. Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I have a friend with me named Fawaz. He is a Cradle Eastern Syriac Catholic. He's a husband, father of 4, and his passions consist of cigars, music, and moral theology. And he's also known as Enoch, the Catholic rapper. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
You're awesome. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So a while ago we met, and I was actually on your live stream on Instagram. That's
right.
A long time ago. So finally,
during the lockdowns, actually.
Yeah, that was crazy time, huh?
Oh yeah.
It's crazy to see where we came from and now where we are. So it's great to have you on the podcast. Why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself besides what I just told them? Any details you want to tell them?
Sure. Yeah. Like you said, a husband for 8 years now. 4 kids, 4 boys. Actually, 3 and 1 on the way, due in May. My oldest, we love Catholic names, especially early church fathers, saints. And so my oldest, his name is Athanasius Fulton.
I love
my
it.
Second, thanks. My second is Ephraim Benedict. My youngest right now is Ambrose Joachim.
Oh, he's named after my saint too.
Is it Ambrose?
Mm-hmm. I'm Amber Rose, so it's like split up.
Oh, that's right. That is right. Amber Rose. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's Ambrose. Great. Absolutely. That's a good point. And the one on the way is Clement Charbel. I am Eastern Catholic. My wife is Irish, so she's West. The funny part about this is she's Irish. I'm from Northern Iraq, so we're Irashis, the Irashi family. But we're there. So because I'm Eastern Catholic, their baptism and confirmation happen on the same day, so they're all confirmed already. We don't have to wait till they're.
I heard that's something.
teenagers.
I just went to a Byzantine ceremony and they did that. We witnessed a baptism and that's what they did. There was like confirmation and everything too.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Don't the Byzantines do all 3 sacraments, including First Communion?
They do all.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting to witness, you know?
Yeah. I really wish my tradition would do that, my Eastern tradition, but no, we have the confirmation as well. So their confirmation names, we get to pick them. My oldest's confirmation name is Pio, Saint Pio.
Hmm. I love that.
My second boy is Saint Vincent Ferrer, one of my favorite saints,
Wow.
and my third boy's name for confirmation saint is Polycarp.
I was about to ask if one of them had like a Polycarp because we just had his feast day not too long ago. And I'm like, man, I
Yeah,
don't know a lot of Polycarps.
yeah, it's one of those like you don't really pick for a first name because it just doesn't sound that great. But it's great you can just like slide it in a confirmation saint and it's just perfectly acceptable.
Exactly. No, that is so fun. Oh, I love it. Eastern Rite Catholics, you guys have such a unique form of liturgy that like is fascinating
Yes,
to me.
it is. Yeah, it is. The Syriac rite is actually closer to the Latin.
Oh,
Um, so aesthetic wise and how the mass is conducted. The Byzantines are a little bit more closer to the Eastern Orthodox liturgy. Um, so I attend a fraternity of St. Peter because I live in Kentucky and you're not going to find an Eastern Catholic mass in Kentucky. So,
yeah. Is that
but
is
yeah, I go to the.
Fraternity of St. Peter, is that FSSP or is that
Mhm.
okay?
Yeah,
Because
the
I always try to like
FSSP, the
match up
Latin mass.
the the letters with the names.
Right.
Well, that's really
Yeah,
awesome. I know I'm a Latin mass goer myself, but I went to my first
that's right.
Byzantine, what is it? Divine liturgy? Is
Yeah,
that how you
correct. The
okay.
Divine Liturgy. Yeah. What did you
Yeah,
think?
it was really, really cool. I'm gonna be honest. I have a lot more sympathy for people who go to the traditional Latin mass for their first time. Despite the fact it was in English, I was lost. So I was lucky enough to have some friends who ended up going with me. Um, and they showed me where they were at in the book and like this is what we're doing now. Lots of signs of the cross, lots of standing, not a lot of kneeling or anything like that, but it was
Right,
really
right.
cool to experience.
No, that's great. Yeah, they stand a lot. The Eastern Orthodox don't sit at all. I think there's no chairs. It's a standing only for the whole
Which,
liturgy. So
if I'm correct, that's actually more traditional because we didn't end up getting pews
correct.
until the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. That's according the legend has it right. According to the
Yeah.
tradition,
Wherever you
the
get your information from.
blame everything on the Protestants
Yeah.
as we should.
That's what you got to do, sometimes.
Yeah,
So, I guess jumping into our topic then. So, today we're
sure.
talking about spiritual theology and virtue, and
Right.
vices and all that kind of fun stuff. So, I guess just jumping in, why don't you give a background of what spiritual theology actually is?
Sure. Yeah. Spiritual theology and moral theology are going to be almost similar. Um, it's actually extremely ancient. It's if we're talking about tradition, nothing, I would say maybe a handful of doctrines and dogmas that were discussed more from the beginning of the church until the development that we have right now of any doctrine. Um, is discussed more than spiritual theology. You go back to even the patristic fathers from the very early on. They were talking about of this idea of being perfected in virtue and growing in holiness. That's pretty much what it is. It's just growing in holiness and becoming imitators of Christ in holiness and in virtue. And then you get to the scholastic fathers, which in the Middle Ages, what they call um, St. Thomas Aquinas spends a lot of his Summa theology talking about vices and virtues. And then you get more into the um, closer to Vatican One, even Vatican Two has an incredible documents of Vatican Two that express this call to holiness, and so that's what spiritual theology really is. It's this call to become as holy as you God wants you to be, and this call to be as perfected in virtue like Christ was.
That's beautiful. And so the
Yeah,
best way to do that is to practice virtue because practice makes perfect.
yeah,
Most things.
exactly. Yeah.
So I guess what are some virtues that you notice are overlooked in society today that maybe
Yeah.
Christians aren't really practicing as much?
Um, I think it would be great to maybe like according to St. Thomas's understanding, because he was Aristotelian in order in understanding his idea of virtue. So according to St. Thomas, the general idea of virtue is a habit that disposes an agent or a person to perform its proper operations of movement. Because we know that reason is proper operation of a human person. Following that, the virtue is a habit that disposes, the reason well. So, for example, virtue is in the mean. So every action has its mean to an end, and the virtue seeks that mean to complete that end perfectly, and that becomes a habit. And vice is what's called excess and defect. And talk about examples. According to Saint Thomas himself, even there's actually 64 different virtues. We know of the main, the four cardinal virtues. Of course, we know of them. But there's actually 64 different ones, because then you have the cardinal virtues, the main ones. So, which is, you've got prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Those are the four cardinal virtues. Under those fall what we call the seven heavenly virtues. As you know, those are like, what is it? What are those? Chastity, humility, meekness, and so forth. And under those fall what St. Thomas calls the daughters of virtues. So under those, the daughters, and those have different layers of virtues under those. So there's a lot of virtues that I think are neglected. We focus on the main ones, like humility, the virtue of humility, the virtue of patience, and stuff like that. So, but one of the virtues I think that is extremely neglected is the virtue of religion, which is actually is a sub virtue under the virtue of justice. And the definition of religion, according to St. Thomas, I think this is the perfect definition. It is a virtue by which we render to God what is due to him. You don't get to tell God how he needs to be worshiped. You just render unto him what he is asking you to do. And that is the virtue of religion. This is where the church has always been about. What is Christ asking us to do? Why we don't have why we don't have women priests? Because Christ not asked us to do that. That is the virtue of religion in that sense. So, go ahead. I'd love for you to come in and have a conversation.
No, yeah, I think that's amazing, because I honestly see it a lot too. I don't think people realize how, in a way, I guess all the virtues kind of piggyback off of each other, in the sense of, if you struggle with justice, you probably struggle with pride, because you don't want to give God what is due, because you have, this inclination, like, I want to do what I want to do, which is kind of like a pride thing. And so I see that a lot in my generation, where it's all about me. It's very relativistic, it's my truth is my truth, and that's that. Like, don't bother me, don't tell me what I should be doing. And I noticed that a lot, in my generation, and even other generations. I can't just pinpoint it to one. But especially the fact that, like, nobody wants to be told that they're wrong these days. Nobody, actually, let me rephrase that. Nobody can be told that they're wrong these days. They'll throw a fit, people can't take criticism, even if it's constructive. Everybody's offended. And I'm not sure if that is a vice versus a virtue. Like, is there a vice that matches?
Yeah, it's called pertinacity. Actually.
Oh, that's a word.
Yeah, it's actually the definition of that. I think it's the excessive clinging to one's assertion or intellectual conviction, whether it's wrong. Even if it's wrong, like, you persist, and it falls under a fortitude.
Okay.
Because it also falls under pride. It's a vice of pride, is the fact that you're excessively clinging onto a worldview that is not based in reality, and you won't let go of it, even if you're told that the truth, and you're persistent in it. And you're absolutely right. Most generations dealt with this, but I think yours and my generation, it's getting worse and worse. They're holding on to these false understanding of reality, and everything is subjective feeling, that we have to conform to their feelings versus them conforming to actual reality.
Right. No, it's so true. And I think a lot of the times, because of the fact that, it's a blessing, but also a curse, that we haven't had any real hard times, in a while.
Yeah.
That are
so true.
We've gotten so comfortable. There's been no real suffering. We're still able to go to the supermarkets and things like that. And even when COVID hit, like, we were still able to go to the market. We were still able to go out. Nothing really changed for us here. It probably changed in some other places. But when it comes to, like, hardcore suffering, but then also learning how to suffer with joy.
Mhm.
That was lost after, I would want to say, World War II, maybe.
Sure.
Because after the Great Depression, because everybody was struggling to feed their
Right.
families and everything, but they had that community and the virtues, and they had God, because at that time it wasn't a completely godless society, and they relied
Mhm.
on those things. And that's what got them through. And despite the fact they went through these hard times, they came out as stronger people. And many of them probably struggled with mental disorders and things like that, especially
Right.
soldiers after wars. But now, because of the fact we've become so comfortable, somebody freaks out, like there's this whole thing going on with Ukraine right now. But here in America, if you call somebody the wrong pronouns, it's like
Right.
World War III. Okay. They're going to sue you for everything you own. They're going to try and take you to court. They're going to, like, it's insane. And I'm like, do you understand how privileged you actually are?
Oh yeah.
So I wonder if there's some kind of demonic interference almost that's blinding people from
Sure.
seeing that, because there's always a spiritual factor in those
Of
things.
course. Yeah, no, that's such a great point. I'm glad you brought up World War II. Who was I think it was, I know Father, Father Ripperger
Yeah, I
himself.
love Father Ripperger.
Yeah, he's great. When it comes to understanding of Thomistic theology, he's like one of the best living today. Actually, we haven't had good Thomistic philosophers and theologians in the world. Gary Gula-Grange back in Vatican II was excellent,
Mm-hmm.
but he talks about how there was this the passing on the suffering from a parent to a child is one of the most important things to do. As a matter of fact, passing on virtue and helping your child grow in virtue is the most important thing, because that pertains to their sanctification, which in return pertains to
Right.
their salvation. But it, I think because as a whole, the world went through so much at the time, they didn't want their kids to go through the suffering. You always get the parents, they always say, I want my children to have more than I did. And I'm just like, well, how do you know if that is what is pertaining to their sanctification? What if God wants to give them more suffering than you had? Because that's how he's going to save their souls. There's
Mm-hmm.
always, I think a lot of times parents just need to get out of the way and let God do his thing. And we're always planning this, how many kids do I want, and I'm going to interfere with this and that. But yeah, there is a generational spirit that is within society, and mainly because anytime, and let's talk about God's mercy at this point. Any single time that you commit a mortal sin, the natural end of that mortal sin is possession,
Mm-hmm.
because you're giving your will to the enemy. Every single time you commit a mortal sin, that's the natural end. But 99.9999% of the time, God blocks that because of his mercy. So the fact that you got generations that have not only are not willing to suffer, are not willing to strive in mortification, which is the willingness to suffer. When you have nothing but comfort, it ends up building the vice in the soul. Now let's take 7 billion people who are, let's just take 5 billion people who all have vice in their soul, and expect society not to have any effect is ludicrous.
Literally. And not to mention, like, we see the detriment that it has on our society today
Right.
because of the fact, like, now our society is a society of death, like our culture of death. It's insane with abortion and
Right.
then euthanasia. And it just keeps going because people don't want to suffer. Like, people, and
Right.
suffering isn't always a bad thing. Let's say you have an unexpected pregnancy. Well, it's going to take suffering, but you suffer for that child out of love. Out of
Sure.
suffering comes love.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Out of suffering comes love. As a matter of fact, that's the definition of love: to do the great, to will the greater good of the other individual, no matter what it costs you. And I don't know if you've heard this before, but you get people who say, "Well, what's the big deal? The person is just committing, an act in their own room. It's not affecting anybody. It's not harming anybody. It's just by themselves. Why can't they just be by themselves and perform this act? Whether it be the act against the sixth and ninth commandment, for example. Saint Louis de Montfort actually has an incredible quote on this, and he wrote it in his book. I think it's called Letter. The book's, I think, Letter to the Friends of the Cross. I think is what it is. And in there he says, and I'm going to try and summarize what he says. It's actually kind of funny. He goes, "Be careful not to admit into your society those delicate and sensitive people who are afraid of the slightest pinprick, or those who cry out and complain at the least pain, or know nothing about hair," because he calls hair shirts and instruments of discipline. The reason why he says that is because the only reason why you build virtue, other than the fact that you're giving glory to God in every action that you do because you're perfecting that action within the means in the end, is the fact that you are creating you're creating in yourself a person that has the habit of always choosing the greater good of the other individual, because the proper end always is the greater good, right? So when you have somebody who is so full of vice, even that person is not committing, for example, the sin to another individual, they're preparing their soul and their senses to actually choose the lower faculty, which man has three faculties, the lower faculty, to be greater than the greater good of the other individual. And literally, any decision that you make, the decision is either I'm going to sacrifice myself and my passions for the greater good of the other person, or I'm going to sacrifice that person to feed for my lower passions. I'm going to degrade their dignity.
Right.
And a viceful person won't even think twice about sacrificing somebody else for their own lower passions. This is why virtue is important.
And that's the thing. It's like Jesus literally told us there's no greater gift than laying your life down for a friend.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like to cherry pick these days and be like, oh, that's not what he meant though. He meant like mentally, like I have to mentally, I'm like, no, he literally said death. Deal with it.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. That's so true. This is why John Paul II called Saint Maximilian Kolbe the greatest saints of the 20th century, because he literally did that. He gave up his life, not even for a friend, for someone who didn't even know.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of it too, is that you don't need to know somebody to give your life up for them,
Right.
Because of the fact we're all children of God. In our eyes, we should all view each other equally, in the sense of this is a human worth saving, and I know God and I'm right with God, hopefully, and all these things. And I want to give this person the chance to do the same,
Sure.
And so taking away that person's chance, could be, God might have planned for that too and have some extra saving, because St. Padre Pio even said that he's still praying for the happy death of his great grandfather who died almost like 100 years ago, because God is outside of space and time. So the prayers that you pray now could go towards somebody and save them in the past. Almost it's kind of brain tricky,
No, that's a great point that you brought up. No, that's absolutely true. No, yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I think St. Pio was quoting Augustine there. And it's a great point there. But yeah, you mentioned prayer. It is the foundation of the build virtue. Now, you could do certain things out of your own will to help build virtue. This is the whole point of Lent, is to deny ourselves, so that way the flesh, the lower faculty of the person, because man is made of three faculties. The highest is the intellect, the second is the will, and the lowest is the emotions. And the intellect is the highest because it's simplest and it seeks to know truth. The will doesn't do anything without the intellect. The will cannot will evil in of itself. This is super interesting to me. When I was studying this, I found this super interesting. That and grace are the two topics I love. But the will can't actually choose evil. What happens is the intellect ends up convincing the will that what you're choosing is actually a good, but it's a lesser good.
That's actually
it is a good. It is crazy, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to convince yourself, like, okay, it is good, because every sin is choosing something good in the, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because what you're doing is you're choosing the lesser good. It was good for Eve to eat the fruit because it was delightful to the senses. It was
Right.
good to give to her husband because it was delightful to the senses. It gives knowledge and all that stuff, right?
Hmm.
But it was a lesser good because the greater good is to obey God in that sense. So the greater good is always going to be, am I going to retract from the glory of God, or am I going to add to it? And every single time I retract from it, I end up, you know, my soul gets damaged. I damage the other person. Society gets damaged, and it just becomes a problem.
Isn't it true that the
And
more we sin, the more we damage our intellect? Is that correct?
yes, absolutely, yes. Sin makes us stupid. It's just that's it's as easy as that. Um, and mercy is for the stupid. I can say that here, right? I don't
Mhm.
know
Yeah,
how
yeah.
this
No, you're
works. Okay,
fine.
good.
We're not snowflakes here. We
Okay,
enjoy hard truth.
okay, good. I just didn't want to think that this will flag it and like people kick it off. It's like this guy's cursing.
No, I
Um,
highly doubt that.
but okay, good. But because the sin literally makes us dumb. Because we're literally putting violence to our intellect. This is why confession is so important, because what confession does, because it's an actual grace. God gives us the actual grace to go to confession. When you sit to confession, you are literally telling the judge, who's the priest, who's in persona Christi, your sins, because the will then began to sorrow is what it should have done before you committed the sin. But the intellect convinced it that what you're actually doing is a greater good when it was actually the lesser good. So if you
Right.
take any sin that you could think of and you could apply that entire method to any sin, any active sin, for example, like the sin of masturbation, it is a lesser good because it satisfies a lower faculty, but then it brings on the guilt after. But the
Right.
greater good is for you to not engage in that,
Hmm.
because the greater good is for you to glorify God and to save yourself, for your spouse. And if you don't have that habit, a virtue, then your future spouse is going to have a problem later on
I think it's interesting
trying to
too
get you to
because a
do
lot
this.
of people, no, I completely agree because a lot of people think that sins like that are only pertaining to them. They don't realize that once they get into marriage, their sins are magnified. They don't stay small and they don't stay hidden at that point.
Oh yeah,
What
absolutely.
becomes your vice is now your wife or your husband's vice.
Mm,
And if you keep that a secret, that is in a way undermining your marital vows, until there's all of these trust things you build up. And secrets,
sure.
there's no place for secrets in marriage.
Yeah, yeah. I been 8 years, 8 years of marriage. It's
Congratulations.
been thank you. Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful. Yeah, my wife's just so great. She's got so much virtue. Um, and but and I'm gonna take back to the Louis de Montfort quote in his book. We talked about be careful not to admit in your society those delicate and sensitive people who are afraid of the slightest. How about let's change that? No, be careful not to admit anybody in your marriage
Hmm.
or in your who's delicate and afraid, who are not willing to suffer, who have the fear of suffering. So,
I
but
definitely think that's a trait to look for in a wife, or especially a husband, but also a wife is like, are they willing to put, you know, are they willing to suffer? Are they willing to suffer for the kids? Are they willing to suffer for their marriage? Are they willing to grow and not stay where they're at? Are they willing to grow in virtue and things?
right, yeah. No, that's a good point. I think both parents need to have that virtue. Um, so who is it? What's his name? One of my favorite spiritual writers, Saint Alphonsus Liguori.
Oh yeah, I love
The
St.
more,
Alphonsus.
yeah, Saint Alphonsus is great. He's the moral doctor of the church. He's all he. There's if anybody is out there is looking for something great to read, he wrote a short, really short article. I think it was at the time, and the guy never stopped writing. It was on the virtue of parenting. He gives advice to parents on what to do to raise kids, and majority of the time he's talking about the fact that the parents have to have virtue in order to instill that virtue into their children. Just saying something Christ did not just teach us things, and it wasn't just teaching of perfection. He was perfect himself, because he was that example of what we strive to become. The imitation of Christ is the perfection of virtue, because Christ was perfect in virtue. So was Our Lady. She had no concupiscences, which is the appetite of lust and gluttony and sloth. And then you have the irascible appetite, which is the appetite for anger. Our Lady had no concupiscences, and there's two things that God gave Our Lady that He had previously given Eve, and one of them was no concupiscences, which means Mary never had any interior difficulties or struggles when it came to temptation. All the temptations came from outside, like Satan or anybody who tried to tempt her. There was no interior temptation. She knew exactly what to do at all times, and she was perfectly virtuous.
That's always amazing to me when I don't forget about it, but it's just one of those things you don't think too hard about. But then when you do, you're just like, man, it would have been nice to know somebody like that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I think, to be honest with you, like me at the state I'm in right now, if I like sat with Our Lady and how perfect she is, I don't know if I could. I think I'd be uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, that would happen. That would definitely happen, because you're sitting in the presence of Jesus's mother, but also she's perfect, in
Right.
the sense of, she's not divine, but she's perfect. And it's just one of those things where I always just like, it just blows my mind. And I guess on the topic of virtue too, she had all those virtues, and back then it was easy to practice virtue because there was always somebody in need, always somebody who needed help. And for the most part, you met those people right on the street, or they could be your neighbors,
The Good Samaritan.
Yeah. And nowadays, despite the fact we still have neighbors and we still see homeless people on the streets and stuff, it's easier now to ignore them. I feel like, maybe not. I don't know if you have a take on that, but I do feel like nowadays it's easier to just kind of like walk by a homeless person, not think twice about it, than it was like back then, because back then they lived in little villages. So that person on the street could have been your neighbor, could have been your sibling. Nowadays it's kind of like strangers. And I believe it was Pope Benedict XVI who said that like the world offers you comfort, but you were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness.
Yes, correct.
And so because of that, because I feel like we have so many little things at the tips of our fingers, like we have phones, we have fast food, we have Uber Eats, we have cars, all these things, everything's pleasurable now. And because of that, I feel like our initial level of pleasure keeps going up, because we're like, we want more, we want more, we want more. And we aren't just satisfied ever.
Right.
And so
never satisfied.
Right. And I feel like through practicing virtues, and of course, I think one of the best ways to do that is through the corporal works of mercy. I don't know if you have a say on that. But I feel like that's very helpful, because it kind of gives us a basis, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, bury the dead. I'm not going to bury the dead, no offense, but like, you know what I mean? I'm not going to bury people if it's, not a cemetery.
It's like those like old mafia movies where like they like whack someone off and like a shovel in the middle of nowhere burying someone.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not. Yeah, I don't see that. I don't see you doing that, Amber.
I don't think I have the facilities for that.
No, I think what you said is absolutely correct. What's interesting about that is, I think the church's understanding of society is what is called the principle of subsidiarity. It's supposed to be localized: families, neighbors, friends, community. But I think in the past, I don't know how many years, you can take a wild guess. I think we've kind of substituted that, and we've allowed the government to become the one. It's like we just expect the government to take care of all the homeless people, the government take care of all the mothers, the government take care of all the the single fathers, and charity has really gone down. And especially there was a study. Whether it was leftists or conservatives or atheists or religious, who gives more time and money to charity? And the study showed that it's not even close. It's actually conservatives and religious folks. And the reason is because the idea of religion in itself, I think, kind of motivates us to go out and become gospel-like, um, folks.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about that is I think the atheist philosophy or leftist philosophy is always going to be that's something for the government to take care of. You're going to defer your duties of being a Christian or a neighbor or just a good human person. You're going to defer that to someone else and say, well, I pay my taxes and they go ahead and take it. There's that, this, and that. I don't need to pay for anything else anymore. And that I think that causes a problem in society as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other thing is for sure is when when I look at like Facebook and things like that, like I'll see these posts like 1 like equals 1 prayer. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. Like,
It's
what are
so
you
weird.
talking about?
It's so silly.
Or they'll
It's
be
funny.
like, retweet or Jesus doesn't love you, or retweet and Jesus will bless you. I'm like, that's not how it works, sweetheart.
This is called superstition, right?
Literally. And the
Yeah.
funniest thing is I don't really see Catholics retweeting that stuff. I see Protestants. No offense to my Protestant brothers and sisters, but like,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I've never really seen any of my Catholic friends retweet that kind of thing.
Yeah. No. Yeah. You're right. I've seen those before, and it's kind of to me, it's just superstition. It's and look at media, for example. I mean, this is, you introduced me as Enoch, the Catholic rapper. I mean, I've been rapping for years. I took a 10-year hiatus from it, from the last time I tried to do something. And I got an album coming out on April 19th called Traditionis.
Very exciting.
And my thing about music is music's important because it shapes a culture. It really does. Nothing shapes a culture like music. And not only does it shape a culture, but you know what your culture is like from the music.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way, sometimes we complain about these horrendous lyrics from some of these rappers that are forming our consciousness and conscience of children that we're submitting to. It's because I don't think we've done well enough as Catholics and even as Protestants or Christians or whatever you want to call it, those who are more conservative and want to hold on to the natural law. We haven't done a good enough job of changing the economy of supply and demand. And I think one of the reason that is because, and I'll be honest with you, there's not many artists out there in that realm that are worth giving your supply to or demand to from the supply. Because for some reason, people think when they make music for Christ, that it has to be mundane, boring, and just subpar to what the secular world has given them.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be that way. This is why I'm literally trying to make an album that you would not be able to distinguish production wise and music wise, the level of music from a secular world, but actually has a good Catholic and traditional message to it. Because I think if we change the supply and demand, economic supply and demand, it literally shifts the culture the other direction. Because we used to have a Catholic culture or a Protestant culture in this country, to where everything had to go under the approval of a pastor or a priest, even movies back in the 50s, the 40s and 50s. And that shift changed because we decided to give the supply, and they supplied it, and we demanded more of it, and now we're just getting cheap we're getting off of high off of cheap candy, versus actually
Auto-tune.
things that are good. So it's auto-tune, all that stuff. It's really interesting. Now, music in itself can be harmful to the soul, not just the lyrics. I don't know.
I've heard
the
of like
reason
different
is
hertz
because
and things like that, like different.
yeah,
They have different vibrations, and so the
they
vibrations
do.
can affect your mood and things like that.
You're educated. I like that.
Yeah,
Most
my
people
mom.
don't know this.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, no, most people don't know this. There was this big church that had this gigantic, remember the old school bells on top of the church, like the cathedrals. If you stood next to it and the bell would go through, there would be this vibration that would come through the bell that would literally give you physical pleasure.
Oh.
Like that's how vibrations, music, or just sound can affect that. Now, music has a hierarchy as well. Its hierarchy, its proper hierarchy is harmony, melody, and rhythm. The only music out there that is perfected in that hierarchy is going to be Gregorian chant and classical. Those are the only two that actually follow that hierarchy. The intellect is the melody, the will is the harmony, and the rhythm is the emotion. Rap music, rock music, pop music is syncopated, which means it takes the hierarchy and turns it around. Now it's distorted. Now the first thing that it attracts is the emotion. And then what happens with a person who gets used to that? Now, it's not intrinsically evil. I would never make an album, a rap album that is intrinsically evil. It just has to be moderated in listening. This is why on the album cover, I put in it, this music is to be moderated so you can have virtue over it. And the reason that is because once you get to a point where your lower faculties, your emotions are the main factor of your decision making, then they become the measure in which we measure truth. We become the art. We become the vessel in which we expect everybody else to say conform to my truth, because our emotions, our lower faculties, literally start to create our own reality versus what reality is. And this is why you see everyone going out there saying, "Call me by my pronouns," because I feel a certain way, and now you've measured truth according to your own emotion versus actual reality.
Right. I literally had somebody who got offended because I didn't call them by their gamer tag. And I was like, boy, I'm not calling you like Neomancer 4432. Like, no,
goodness.
we're not happening.
It's hilarious.
But it's true. It's like, it's crazy how, I guess, egotistical people can be. I'm like, I'm just gonna call you Ned. How about that? Like,
yeah.
We're
Your
not
mother named you Ned. I'm calling you Ned. Yeah.
That's what's happening. Yes. And I just find it interesting because it's true that music impacts us. And that's probably why I was so depressed in high school, because Amber listened to My Chemical Romance and all of these interesting bands. And every now and then I will say I do enjoy a little bit Chemical Romance every now and then, but it's, it's fine, once a month. If that, it'll like pop up randomly on my Spotify playlist, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, this song from when I was like 12, let's go.
Nostalgia.
That's about it though. And then I'm like, all right, that's over, never again.
Right.
And it's just interesting how that happens, because I used to be woken up with like Beethoven. I don't know if you know who James Taylor is, the musician.
That's familiar.
Okay, he's kind of like bluegrassy kind of rock.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know, but he did a lot of songs. So like my mom would wake us up with like Vivaldi or Mozart or James Taylor. And I think it just helped us to kind of like not be so weird as kids. I don't know.
Well, I think it also helps your intellect too. I think that's why, just you personally, I think you seek the natural law. You're a sane person because you follow proper logic.
I hope I'm sane. I don't know. A lot of people on TikTok would beg to differ.
if we're comparing it to your generation, I think you're extremely sane.
Okay. That's a good comparison. Yeah. I'll take that.
But most people in generation, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think you have a grasp of reality and a grasp of logic, which is important to have. The only time I think music becomes intrinsically evil is not the music itself. The music itself needs to be listened to, to be moderated, is if the words of the song blaspheme God, mm-hmm. or it pertains to immodesty that violates the ninth or the sixth and ninth commandment, which is most rap songs, and most rock
and most country. Also, Getting Drunk is a lot of country songs.
This is true. Huh? Yeah, I didn't think about that. That's true.
Getting Drunk.
Then like Budweiser, Budweiser in a red truck. Yeah.
Delicious.
That's true. Yeah, and getting drunk is a mortal sin. That is correct. Most people don't know that.
It's crazy because a lot of people think don't even know what mortal sin is anymore, Right,
yeah.
In the Bible, it's called deadly sin, but still.
Correct, yeah. Or what the conditions are in order for you to reach, for it to be a mortal sin.
Right.
Yeah, catechesis needs to be, that's the one thing that needs to happen. if well, let me ask you this question, like, what do you think is the reversion back to a sane society? Like, what do you think needs to happen on an individual level? You know,
I
if
honestly,
I say, hey, Amber,
yeah.
you are now in charge of the universe, what would you do?
Um, Honestly, I think I know you said individually, but I think it starts within the family.
Mhm.
So the family is the pillar of society. When you start
Yeah.
outsourcing the home, you start outsourcing yourself. So
Mm,
when kids go to school instead of being homeschooled, there's a problem there because you're not there to teach the kids and they can get into trouble. They're around peers their own age. So they
right,
didn't, back in the old days, we were constantly around people of all different ages and we learned from our elders and we respected our elders. Nowadays, kids are around their same age, and the only time they're around older people is either when they're with their grandparents or with teachers or something like that. So I think the first thing is to stop outsourcing the home and to rebuild the pillar of the family, which means the man is, there's God and then man and then woman and their kids. And that doesn't mean woman
right.
is below the man. It's just the hierarchy is really important there for not becoming a disordered family. Um,
Sure, it's the office, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think individually wise, um, focusing on ourselves and the betterment of other people is
Sure.
really important. And I don't mean focusing on ourselves as in like, did you get a bubble bath? Did you have a chai tea? Are you
Self-care
stressed?
type stuff.
Yeah, it's more like focusing on
Virtue.
yourself. Yeah, virtue, like what we're
Right,
talking about.
right,
And with virtue comes care for other people, because through
right.
suffering we love. And so I think just kind of mortifying ourselves, and Lent is the perfect time for that. And so I
Yes.
guess the last question I have for you is, what are
Mhm.
some ways we can really start mortifying ourselves during Lent, but keep it throughout the year and not just do it for these 40 days?
Oh, that's okay. That's good. Well, thank you for that. Actually, what you said was great. I 100% agree.
Thank you.
Um, I would I would say this. Know who you are by doing the examination of conscience of your own soul. And the reason I say that is because now I am a fan. You've heard of Exodus 90, and most
Yeah.
people have. I'm a fan of what they do generally. Objectively, I'm a fan. Their approach and how to build virtue is good for a certain person. For example, I have friends who think that it's a joke because like I do this on a daily basis. I will get nothing out of this. Like I've already like I have no attachment to alcohol, sweets, or anything that they ask me to give up. Then you got the other person who has no virtue whatsoever, who's just used to pleasure and sloth and gluttony. They pick up Exodus 90 and it becomes a more of a pride thing. I have to finish this, I have to finish this, I have to finish this. And then if they get through it, if they don't fall, if they get through it, they go back to excess. It was like, hey, I did it now. Let me chug all the alcohol and the M&Ms as I possibly can. You've just missed the point of the whole practice of it.
Right.
Now, you have somebody who's in the middle there who's kind of like, has some virtue, but has struggles with a little bit of vices. That's the perfect person, I think, for something like that. You have to know who you are, what your limitations are. Don't take up too much things this Lent. The reason what was it? I think Saint Therese, who I think yeah, Saint Therese was the one who said that if you it was Avila or Teresa, Saint Therese of a Little Flower, I can't think of which one, but she literally said if you took every single year, especially during Lent, and you focused on one vice, by the time you're an older person, you're perfected in virtue already
Hmm.
because you've just literally started eliminating all the vices that came with your temperaments, that came from your upbringing, that came from the fact that you neglected building virtue as a young person, whatever it may be. So, but there is this one virtue that a lot of people don't um, remember is the virtue of providentia. It's actually a very incredible, important virtue. And providentia is the virtue of making future decisions based on past experiences. Like if you're gluttonous, for example, and you have no moderation when it comes to food, the the best thing to do is, let's say, for example, I'm gonna go out to a restaurant, if I'm eating throughout the day, you get that journal out, and in Providentia, you look at the past 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and you write down, okay, where did I mess up every night? Okay, where did I mess up today? All right, I ate that extra chocolate. I ate chocolate when I could have gone without it. I could have sacrificed. I could have offered up for a soul in purgatory. Okay, so next time I open the fridge, the chocolate is in front of me, I'm going to remember that the soul in purgatory is more important, the greater good of me than fulfilling this just, the simple act of pleasure just in my senses. So you write that down the next day. So that's providential, because you're making future decisions based on your past experiences. And then of course, meditation, and especially meditating on the end, because the beatific vision is the proper end of the human person. That's the whole point of doing any virtue. That's the whole point of receiving communion. That's the whole point of getting confirmation. That's the whole point of anything. It's the fact that we are preparing for heaven, right? So when we contemplate on that, then our eyes are fixed on God. Then what happens is, now we have a purpose and an end that we can aspire to. Then everything else then becomes, I have to choose the greater good for the sake of my proper end. Then it makes it easier. Then it's like, then you start to fall in. Alphonse de Goya talks about the greater love, which is you're no longer loving God out of fear of going to hell, but you're loving him because you don't want to disappoint him, because he's your one true love. And the fact that you will do anything to glorify him, even denying yourself to all cost, for anything, like Saint Anthony the Great did when he went to the desert and said, the world is yours. I just want God.
Right.
But the way to do that is to have virtue over every single aspect of your life, every single thing, anger, virtue over gluttony, virtue over eating and all that stuff, and lust. Once you have virtue over that, then then it becomes an act that you can glorify God over and over and over again. But this Lent, take the time and practice providentia.
I love that. No, that's perfect, especially giving me some tips too, because I'm like, how on earth am I going to keep doing this? No, that's wonderful. So thank you so much for coming on here. Where can my followers find you? Well,
I'm also on Instagram, Holy 40 Project, but I will have that album out. I really want to put it out there and let folks judge that, the fact that, hey, listen, even those who are making music for Christ are actually making decent music, and it's not boring and it's not horrible. Hopefully that's what they'll say. Some people won't hate it, whatever. But Holy 40 Project is going to be my Instagram, and then Enoch. I'll be on Spotify and all the other stuff later on.
Perfect.
And but I appreciate you having me on, having a conversation with you, and just for the sake of your listeners and learning from you as well. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And with all of that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast episode, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye. Do you have questions or comments about today's episode? Email me at thereligioushippie@gmail.com or leave a voice message at anchor.fm/thereligioushippie. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening.
'Tis the season to shine with H&M. Discover the holiday collection and find fashionable pieces for your wardrobe or for under the tree. Get inspired and dazzle with this year's glam. From tuxedo styles, bow detailed pieces, impressive prints, and more. From unforgettable looks to unforgettable gifts. With fashion finds to home decor, find it all at H&M. Treat your loved ones and yourself this season. Shop in-store or at hm.com.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org, or find us on social media for other unique content.